Hi, everyone. Right now at 6, a senior living facility employee accused of killing a millionaire philanthropist in Potomac facing a judge for the first time.
Marquise James is being held without bond. Prosecutors claiming this attack was premeditated.
He was hired to keep an elderly man alive. He had the keys to the building. He knew the schedule. He knew exactly when the halls would be quiet. And on Valentine's Day, the one night a year the whole world talks about love, 87-year-old Robert Fuller was shot in the head while he lay in his bed. The man prosecutors say pulled that trigger. He had just handed Fuller his medication an hour before. Now, at this point, you might be asking yourself, how does something like this even happen? How does a man entrust his safety, his medication, his entire nightly routine to someone, and that same someone allegedly becomes the last person he ever sees? Stay with me here, because this story does not have easy answers, and the one question everyone keeps asking, why, still does not have one. This is the story of Robert Fuller Jr. and Marquis James, and it happened right in the middle of an ordinary week at a place that was supposed to be the safest room in the building. Welcome to Crime and Humanity. Every crime is a human act, shaped by choice, circumstance, and consequence. Crime and humanity are deeply intertwined, and here we explore real cases by looking beyond the act itself, focusing on the people involved and the lives forever changed. We don't just examine crime. Subscribe and turn on notifications as we examine what it reveals about being human. Robert Fuller Jr. was 87 years old. By the time he moved into the Coger Potomac Senior Living Facility in Potomac, Maryland, he had lived a full life. He was known as a millionaire philanthropist, the kind of man who had built something real in his life and used it to give back. He had a partner. He had people who cared about him. And like a lot of elderly people at that stage of life, he needed a little help getting through the day. That is not weakness. That is just what 87 looks like for most of us if we are lucky enough to get there. Behind every case file is a real person. And Robert Fuller was exactly that, a real person in a real bed, in a facility that was supposed to protect him. Now, the facility itself, Coger Potomac Senior Living, is a place where families bring their loved ones when they need around-the-clock care. These are people who cannot fully look after themselves anymore. They depend on the staff. They depend on the structure. They depend on the idea that the people walking those halls at 2 a.m. are there to help them, not hurt them. Marquis James was 22 years old. He was from Baltimore, and he had found work at the facility as a medication technician, a med tech. That is not just a janitor or a front desk worker. A med tech is someone with a specific role, going room to room, administering medication to patients on a schedule. These are residents who, in many cases, cannot manage their own prescriptions. They are trusting you with something as basic and vital as their own treatment. It is a position that requires responsibility. It requires someone who can be trusted alone in a room with a person who is completely vulnerable. And for a while, Marquis James was exactly that person, at least on paper. Here is where it gets heavy. Prosecutors are not saying this was a sudden decision. They are not saying James snapped. What they are saying is that for a full month before Robert Fuller was killed, James had been planning it. Think about that for a second. 30 days. 30 days of showing up to work. 30 days of walking those halls, administering medication, clocking in and clocking out, all while, according to prosecutors, carrying a plan to end an elderly man's life. And yet, nobody saw it coming. Or if they did, it was not enough to stop what happened next. The night of the murder was a regular shift, at least from the outside. James came in, did his rounds, gave patients their medication, including Robert Fuller. That part was normal. That part looked like every other night. But something wasn't adding up. Co-workers later told investigators that James stayed at the facility past the end of his shift. He was still there when he should have been gone. And they remembered something else, a plaid coat. The surveillance cameras inside the facility caught footage that night, and the people who worked alongside James recognized that coat immediately. They knew who was wearing it. Now, at this point, The pieces were starting to come together for investigators, but by the time they did, Robert Fuller was already gone. The facility that was supposed to be his safe place had become the last place he would ever know. And the person trusted with his care, prosecutors say, is the one who made it that way. Damn. Valentine's Day, February 14th. Most people in that building were probably asleep. The halls were quiet. The night shift had that particular stillness that only exists in places like that. Senior living facilities in the middle of the night where the world outside stops mattering and all that exists is the soft hum of medical equipment and the occasional sound of someone moving down the corridor. Robert Fuller Jr. was in his bed, 87 years old. He had already taken his medication for the night. His part of the evening was done. There was nothing left for him to do but rest. And then, prosecutors say, Marquise James walked back into that room, not to check on him, not to do anything a medtech is supposed to do. According to prosecutors, James walked in and he shot Robert Fuller in the head while the man lay right there, defenseless in his own bed, in a place his family had trusted to keep him safe. There is no gentle way to say that. There is no frame that makes it easier to sit with. An 87-year-old man in his bed on Valentine's Day, gone. Now, the facility's surveillance system had been running the whole time, and what it captured that night would later become one of the most important pieces of the investigation. That plaid coat. The one James's own co-workers recognized without hesitation when investigators came asking. The cameras had followed someone through those halls past the end of a shift that should have already been over. Moving on, because what happened next is the part that tells you this was not a person who stopped after one act of violence. The morning after Robert Fuller was killed, Marquis James was in Baltimore County, and he was not laying low. During a traffic stop, he fired at a Maryland state trooper twice, at close range, and then fled the scene. The trooper survived. Prosecutors called it a miracle, and given the distance between them when those shots were fired, that word was not used lightly. Now law enforcement had their man. The charges were stacking fast. First-degree murder in Montgomery County, attempted murder out of Baltimore County. There was a manhunt for a 22-year-old wanted on both counts. And yet, 2 days later, police found him standing outside the district courthouse in Rockville. He had shown up for a traffic citation. Let that sit for a moment. Wanted for murder and the attempted murder of a police officer. And he walked into a courthouse for a traffic ticket. When officers searched his car, they found ammunition scattered across the floorboard, not hidden, just there. There's the twist between crime and humanity right there. On one hand, a 22-year-old with his whole life ahead of him. On the other, an 87-year-old who spent a lifetime building something, and who spent his last moments in a bed he should have been safe in, with someone prosecutors say had been planning his death for a month. Crime leaves scars. Through the Fuller family, through the co-workers who recognized that plaid coat on a surveillance screen, through the trooper who nearly did not make it home, and through every family with a loved one in a place just like Coger Potomac, trusting that the people walking those halls at night are exactly who they say they are. The arrest had been made, but the question everyone kept circling back to still had no answer. Why Robert Fuller? Nobody was saying, and as the case moved into the courtroom, that silence became one of the loudest things about it.
Yeah, Annie, prosecutors are calling this a pre-planned, cold-blooded killing. Investigators believe that Marquise James had been planning this for a month. Today, we also learned that when James was taken into custody, it was here, outside of District Court in Montgomery County. He had appeared for a traffic citation, and inside of his vehicle, police say they found ammunition all over this floorboard. So as you mentioned, James will remain behind bars without bond. His attorney has requested a competency hearing in this case. Investigators say James was a medication technician at Coger Potomac Senior Facility. The night of the shooting, James had given medication to his patients, including 87-year-old Robert Fuller Jr. and Fuller's partner. People who worked at the facility told investigators they recognized that plaid coat seen in surveillance surveillance video. Now, his coworkers also allege that James stayed at the facility past his work shift and that he was acting suspicious. Police haven't revealed a motive in this case. A judge today told James he's also facing a slew of charges out of Baltimore County, including first and second degree attempted murder. That's because James is accused of shooting at a Maryland state trooper who survived. This shooting was at close range, and James fled during a traffic stop in Baltimore County the morning after Fuller was killed. Now, following the hearing today, we did hear from both James's lawyer and Montgomery County's state's attorney.
I'm asking for a gag order in this case. I'm asking for the state's attorney not to talk about this case. I won't be talking about it either, all right?
We're talking about a murder and an attempted murder. We're also talking about the fact that the murder appears to be pre-planned. Also, this was all mentioned in open court today. This is not anything beyond what was said in open court. Also, during a traffic stop directly across the street from where we're standing right now, when he was apprehended, which was 2 days ago, he did attempt flight in that particular case.
The courtroom in Rockville, Maryland, was where everything that had been moving fast suddenly slowed down and got formal. Marquis James appeared before a judge, first in person, and then virtually in a follow-up hearing. He was 22 years old, facing a first-degree murder charge out of Montgomery County for the killing of Robert Fuller Jr., and first and second-degree attempted murder charges out of Baltimore County for the shooting of the state trooper. The judge heard the charges, the judge heard the arguments, and when it came to bond, the answer was simple and firm: no bond. James would remain in jail while the case moved forward. Now, the prosecution's position was not complicated. State Attorney John McCarthy laid it out plainly. This was, in their words, a cold-blooded killing, planned a month in advance. And on top of the murder charge itself, there was the matter of what James did when officers caught up with him. When he was apprehended outside the courthouse, prosecutors noted that he had attempted to flee. That detail, the flight, the ammunition in the car, the attempted murder of a trooper the morning after Fuller was killed, all of it built a picture that made the no bond decision feel like the only logical outcome. The prosecution also made clear that what had been said publicly about the case was not beyond the bounds of what had already been stated in open court. Nothing leaked, nothing speculated, just the facts that had already been presented to a judge. The defense, on the other hand, came in with a different strategy. James's attorney did not address the specifics of the charges publicly. Instead, he made two immediate moves. The first was a request for a gag order, asking the court to prevent prosecutors from speaking about the case outside of the courtroom and committing to the same silence on his own end. The second move was a request for a mental evaluation, asking the court to schedule a competency hearing to determine whether James was fit to stand trial. Both of those moves told a story of their own. The gag order request is a defense tactic that tries to protect a client from a case being tried in the media before it ever reaches a jury. And the competency hearing request signals that the defense was already thinking about how to approach a situation where the facts on the ground were not going to be easy to argue around. The competency hearing was scheduled, the legal machinery was in motion, and James's family, who had been present in the courtroom that day, left without saying a word to the press. No comment, just people trying to process something that most families never have to face. And through all of it, through the hearings, the charges, the legal back and forth, the one thing that never came out was a motive. Investigators had not revealed one publicly. The prosecution had not offered one. There was no explanation on the table for why a 22-year-old medication technician allegedly spent 30 days planning the death of an 87-year-old patient in his care. Anyways, the case was now in the hands of the courts. But for the people closest to this story, the court dates and the legal proceedings were almost beside the point, because no ruling, no sentencing, no verdict was going to answer the thing that mattered most to them. Why Robert Fuller? At the heart of this story is something that does not get talked about enough. When we place our elderly loved ones in a care facility, we are making one of the most profound acts of trust that exists. We are saying, I cannot do this alone, and I need to believe that the people in that building will treat this person the way I would. We hand over the keys to someone else's safety, and we walk out the door hoping we made the right call. Robert Fuller, Jr. was 87 years old. He had built a life. He had resources, people who loved him, a legacy worth talking about, and none of that protected him from what prosecutors say happened in that room on Valentine's Day. Marquis James was 22 years old, young enough to have had an entirely different life ahead of him, young enough that the distance between who he was and who he could have been is almost hard to look at directly. Crime leaves scars, and the particular scar this case leaves is one about trust, about the gap between what a system promises and what it can actually guarantee. Every senior living facility in this country depends on the character of the people it hires. Background checks, training, credentials, all of it matters. And still, sometimes, it is not enough. Behind every case file is a real person. Two of them, actually. One who went to work on Valentine's Day and allegedly chose violence, and one who went to sleep that night and never woke up. Closure is never simple, not for Fuller's partner, not for his family, not for the co-workers at that facility who recognized a plaid coat on a surveillance camera and had to live with what that recognition meant, not for the state trooper who survived 2 shots at close range and has to carry that morning with him for the rest of his life. And not for the rest of us either, because a case like this does not stay inside the courtroom. It follows you home. It makes you think about the people in your life who are aging, who are vulnerable, who depend on strangers to treat them with basic human decency. That is the question this case leaves on the table long after the gavel falls. Not just, what did Marquis James do? But, what do we owe each other? What does it mean to be trusted with someone's life? And what happens when that trust is broken in the most permanent way possible? We may never get the answer to why, but the asking of it matters. Because the moment we stop asking is the moment we stop taking seriously what it costs when one human being decides that another human being's life does not matter. Robert Fuller Jr. mattered, and that should never need to be argued. This has been Crime and Humanity. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And remember, every crime is just another aspect of humanity.